The atmosphere of the gas giant Horizon did not merely exist. It crushed, a relentless physical weight that defined every waking second of Commander Vaxen Thray's existence. He stood within the observation sphere of the deep-pressure vessel Vanguard, watching the swirling ochre and violet clouds scream past the reinforced transparency at speeds that would strip the skin from a man in less than a heartbeat. There was no sun here, only the dim, bioluminescent glow of the atmospheric plankton that drifted in the upper layers, caught in the eternal storms of the planet's crushing depths. Thray adjusted his grip on the command rail, feeling the subtle vibration of the fusion engines fighting against the gravity well that sought to pull them into the metallic hydrogen core far below. His crew was silent, a collection of specialists gathered from the furthest reaches of the peripheral colonies, none of whom shared a common history or a common goal beyond the recovery of the artifact buried in the eye of the Great Vortex. The mission was unsanctioned, a desperate gamble funded by the renegade cartels of the Meridian Rim, and the tension in the bridge was a tangible thing, thicker than the pressurized air circulating through the life support vents. Vaxen looked toward the primary navigator, a woman named Xylia who had replaced her organic eyes with multispectrum sensors capable of piercing the thickest nebula. She did not look back at him, her attention fixed entirely on the shifting currents of the storm. Every adjustment she made to the thrusters was a calculated risk, a dance with physics where the price of a misstep was instant vaporization. The Vanguard groaned, its hull plating protesting the intense thermal fluctuations as they descended deeper into the troposphere. They were hunting for the resonance spires, ancient structures of unknown origin that were said to hold the key to faster-than-light travel, without the need for the volatile fuel crystals that currently choked the galaxy's economy. To the cartels, the spires were a gold mine. To Thray, they were a chance to finally outrun a past that was rapidly catching up to him in the form of the local enforcer fleets. The descent took hours, marked only by the deepening hue of the clouds and the increasing frequency of the lightning strikes that arced between the atmospheric layers. These were not the bolts of a terrestrial world, but massive pillars of plasma that could span hundreds of kilometers, illuminating the dark sky with a terrifying, sickly green light. Thray watched as one such bolt struck the protective shielding of the ship, the energy dissipating in a shower of sparks that reflected off Xylia's metallic eyes. She muttered a series of coordinates under her breath, her fingers flying across the holographic interface with a fluidity that bordered on the preternatural. They were approaching the transition zone, the point where the gas began to behave like a fluid, and the ship's aerodynamics would have to shift to accommodate the change in density. It was a maneuver that had claimed dozens of previous expeditions, leaving their wreckage to drift eternally in the crushing dark. As the Vanguard crossed the threshold, the world outside changed. The chaotic winds smoothed out into a heavy, viscous flow, and the ship's motion became more akin to a submarine than a spacecraft. The bioluminescence was brighter here, provided by massive, floating colonies of gas bags that drifted like jellyfish in the thick air. These creatures, some the size of small cities, ignored the metal intruder in their midst, their long, trailing filaments flickering with internal electricity. Thray felt a sense of profound isolation as they moved past these leviathans. They were intruders in a world that had existed for eons without the touch of humanity, a place where the laws of biology and physics were written in a language they barely understood. He checked the internal chronometer. They had been in the atmosphere for 6 hours, and the pressure outside was now sufficient to flatten a standard combat walker into a disk of scrap metal. The sensor suite began to chime, a low, rhythmic pulse that indicated they had found the first sign of the spires. Thray moved to the tactical station, looking over the shoulder of the heavyset technician known only as Brune. The display showed a series of jagged silhouettes rising from the depths, defying the immense pressure of the planet. These were not geological formations. Their geometry was too precise, their surfaces too smooth. They were towers of dark, non-reflective material that seemed to absorb the light around them, creating holes in the glowing atmosphere. As the ship drew closer, the scale of the structures became apparent. They were kilometers high, anchored to something even deeper in the planet's core, reaching up like the fingers of a buried titan. The Vanguard slowed its descent, the engines humming at a higher pitch as they fought to maintain a hovering position in the turbulent currents surrounding the spires. "Bring us into the lee of the central tower," Thray commanded, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. "We need to deploy the boarding tube before the next storm cycle hits. If we are caught in the open when the pressure differential shifts, the hull will buckle like a tin can." Xylia nodded, her sensors already locking onto a docking aperture she had identified on the spire's surface. It was a small opening, barely large enough for their vessel to dock with, located near a protruding ledge that offered some protection from the wind. The ship banked sharply, the stabilizers whining as they fought the drag of the thick atmosphere. Thray gripped the rail tighter, his knuckles white. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for the moment when his luck finally ran out. He had led them this far, but the real challenge was only just beginning. The docking process was a nightmare of precision. The Vanguard had to match the rotation of the spire while simultaneously countering the erratic buffeting of the wind. Xylia's hands were a blur of motion, her brow furrowed in concentration. The ship shuddered as the magnetic grapples fired, the metallic clank echoing through the hull like a gunshot. For a moment they hung suspended between the ship and the tower, the umbilical cord of the boarding tube extending slowly toward the aperture. Then, with a jarring thud that threw Thray against the bulkhead, the connection was sealed. The green light on the airlock flashed, signaling that the pressure had equalized. They were in. Thray grabbed his pulse rifle from the rack and signaled for the boarding party to assemble. They were entering a tomb that had been sealed for millions of years, and whatever waited inside would not be welcoming to visitors from the stars. The air inside the spire was cold, smelling of ozone and something ancient and metallic. As Thray stepped through the airlock, his boots clicked against a floor made of the same dark, light-absorbing material as the exterior. The walls were etched with intricate, glowing patterns that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, as if the building itself were breathing. There was no sound here, no hum of machinery or rustle of air, only the heavy weight of the silence. He led his team down a long, sloping corridor that spiraled toward the heart of the structure. The light from their shoulder-mounted lamps cut through the gloom, revealing statues of alien figures that seemed to watch them as they passed. These were not the human-like aliens of popular fiction, but multi-limbed, insectoid beings with elongated heads and faceted eyes, their forms captured in poses of supplication or prayer. They reached a massive central chamber, a dome so vast that its ceiling was lost in the darkness above. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it sat the artifact they had come for, a sphere of shifting, iridescent liquid held in place by a containment field of pure energy. This was the heart of the spire, the source of the resonance that could bridge the gaps between the stars. Thray approached the pedestal, his breath hitching in his chest. He could feel the power radiating from the sphere, a vibration that resonated in his very bones. It was beautiful and terrifying, a piece of technology that bypassed everything humanity knew about the universe. He reached out a gloved hand, but before he could touch the containment field, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low, guttural roar echoed through the chamber, a sound that was not mechanical but biological. "Defensive positions," Thray shouted, raising his rifle as the floor began to split apart. From the shadows beneath the pedestal, a creature emerged. It was a mass of shifting plates and glowing sensors, a guardian left behind by the architects of the spire. It did not have a face, only a central eye that burned with a cold, blue light. It moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, its many limbs ending in razor-sharp blades that glinted in the dim light. The crew opened fire, the corridors erupting in a chaos of light and sound. The Guardian moved through the barrage of pulse, fire as if it were nothing, its shields absorbing the energy and reflecting it back at the attackers. Thray saw Brune go down, his chest plate shattered by a single blow from the creature's limb. They were outmatched, trapped in a tomb with a nightmare that had been designed to kill anything that dared to touch the heart. "Fall back to the airlock," Thray yelled over the roar of the battle, but even as he spoke, he knew they couldn't leave without the artifact. If they returned empty-handed, the cartels would hunt them to the ends of the galaxy. He looked back at the sphere, then at the Guardian, which was now tearing through the rest of his team. He had to make a choice. In a moment of desperation, he lunged for the pedestal, ignoring the searing heat of the containment field as he plunged his hands into the energy. The sphere felt like ice and fire all at once, a surge of information flooding his mind, showing him the birth of stars and the death of civilizations. He felt his consciousness expanding, the physical world fading away until there was only the resonance. With a final, agonizing effort, he ripped the sphere from its cradle. The chamber shuddered, the glowing patterns on the walls turning a violent, pulsing red. The Guardian froze, its blue eye flickering and then going dark as the power source of the spire was severed. Thray collapsed to his knees, clutching the sphere to his chest, his vision swimming. He could hear Xylia calling his name from the airlock, her voice sounding thin and distant. He forced himself to stand, his legs feeling like lead, and began to stumble back toward the ship. The spire was dying around them, the internal systems failing as the resonance was removed. Sections of the ceiling began to collapse, crushing the statues and the remains of his crew. He didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. Every instinct was screaming at him to get off the planet before the atmosphere claimed them all. He reached the airlock just as the Vanguard's engines roared to life, the ship pulling away from the spire as the docking clamps failed. Xylia caught him, dragging him inside and slamming the hatch shut just as the boarding tube was torn away by the wind. They were free, but they were not safe. The removal of the heart had triggered a chain reaction within the planet's atmosphere, the great vortex collapsing in on itself and creating a vacuum that threatened to swallow the ship. Xylia dove into the pilot's seat, pushing the engines to their absolute limit. The Vanguard shook violently, the hull screaming as it fought the sudden shift in pressure. Thray watched from the floor, the iridescent sphere still glowing in his hands, its light reflecting in the metallic eyes of the woman who had saved him. They had survived the spire, but the journey was far from over. As the ship broke through the upper cloud layers and into the blackness of space, Thray finally let out the breath he had been holding. Behind them, Horizon looked like a bruised eye in the darkness, the storm systems shifting into new, unpredictable patterns. He looked at the sphere, then at Xylia, who was already plotting a course for the nearest jump gate. They were alone now, the rest of the crew gone, and the most valuable object in the known universe was in their possession. The cartels would be waiting, but Thray had no intention of handing over the heart. He had seen the truth of the resonance, the potential it held to change everything, and he knew that the power it contained was too dangerous for anyone to control. He would take it to the edge, to the lawless territories where the reach of the syndicates was weak, and there he would find a way to use it for his own ends. The stars ahead were cold and distant, but for the first time in years, Thray felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer a mercenary or a fugitive. He was the guardian of a new era. The Vanguard vanished into the void, leaving the dying planet of Horizon behind. The adventure had only just begun, and the price of success had already been paid in blood. He closed his eyes, the hum of the ship's engines a comforting melody in the silence of the cockpit. He was alive, he was free, and he held the future in the palm of his hand. The vacuum of the penumbra expanse offered no sanctuary, only a different kind of pressure that gnawed at the seams of the Vanguard and the sanity of its remaining crew. Commander Vaxen Thray sat in the darkened navigation hub, the iridescent sphere resting on a magnetic gimbal before him. It pulsed with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that seemed to sync with his own heartbeat, a phantom vibration that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull. Xylia remained at the helm, her metallic ocular implants glowing a faint, steady amber as she processed the navigational data required to navigate the jagged gravity wells of the fractured moons surrounding them. They had successfully transitioned out of the Horizon system, but the structural integrity of the ship was failing. The deep-pressure descent had left microfractures in the primary cooling loops, and the life support system was struggling to scrub the metallic tang of ionized ozone from the recycled air. Thray reached out, his fingers hovering just millimeters from the surface of the artifact, which he had begun to think of as the catalyst. He could feel the temperature in the room drop whenever the light within the liquid shifted toward the violet spectrum. It was a piece of engineering that defied the standard thermodynamics of the known systems, acting as a heat sink for a dimension they couldn't perceive. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flickering silhouettes of the insectoid guardians from the spire, their movements recorded in the catalyst like a memory etched into glass. He knew the cartels would have scouts at every major jump gate within 20 parsecs, their long-range scanners tuned to the specific radioactive signature of the Horizon tech. To survive, they needed to disappear into the drift, a graveyard of ancient derelicts and asteroid clusters where the background radiation was thick enough to mask a fusion flare. "We are approaching the perimeter of the shroud," Xylia said, her voice sounding like gravel grinding against silk. She hadn't slept since they broke orbit, her nervous system hardwired into the ship's computer to compensate for the damaged automated pilots. The density of the debris field is increasing. If we don't engage the manual thrusters, the automated proximity sensors will trigger a full emergency halt, and we'll be sitting ducks for any interceptor with a long-range sweep. Thray stood up, his muscles aching from the lingering effects of the high-gravity escape. He moved to the secondary station, his hands moving over the tactile interfaces with a practiced, weary grace. He didn't ask about the cost of the repair or the status of their remaining fuel. He knew the numbers were grim. They were running on fumes and stubbornness, propelled by the weight of the object sitting in the center of the room. The Vanguard plunged into the shroud, a chaotic belt of frozen methane and shattered silicate that ringed a dead star. The view outside the transparency was a frantic blur of gray and white as the ship wove through the celestial junk. Occasionally, the hull would chime with the impact of a pebble-sized fragment, a sound like a hammer hitting a bell. Thray watched the sensor ghost of a derelict freighter, a massive hull of rusted iron that had been floating in the dark for 3 centuries, pass within 100 meters of their starboard side. It was a haunting reminder of what happened to those who lost their way in the expanse. The shroud was a place where ships went to die, but for the Vanguard, it was the only path to the clandestine refitting station known as the Anvil, a hollowed-out asteroid run by a collective of independent engineers who asked no questions as long as the payment was in rare isotopes. As they pushed deeper into the field, the catalyst began to react to the proximity of the dead star's gravitational shear. The liquid inside the sphere began to spin faster, creating a miniature vortex that mirrored the great vortex of Horizon. Thray felt a sudden surge of nausea, the room tilting as if the ship were entering a steep dive. The internal gravity stabilizers flickered, and for a moment he felt weightless, suspended in a cabin that suddenly smelled of ancient dust and dry earth. He looked at Xylia, but she seemed unaffected, her focus entirely on the flight path. The sensation passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving Thray with a lingering sense of dread. The artifact wasn't just a power source, it was a localized distortion in the fabric of space-time, and it was becoming increasingly unstable the further they moved from its point of origin. "Something is following us," Xylia reported, her tone flat but the flicker in her ocular sensors betraying her concern. "I'm picking up a localized warp wake, very faint, masked by the debris. It's not a cartel's signature. The engine harmonics are too smooth, too efficient. It's a pursuit craft from the hegemony." Thray felt a cold spike of fear. The hegemony was the only organized body with the technology to track a ship through a debris field as dense as the Shroud. They were the self-appointed keepers of the peace, but their peace was enforced with plasma lances and orbital bombardments. If they were here, it meant the theft of the catalyst had been detected at a level far higher than the local syndicates. The stakes had just shifted from a corporate heist to a matter of interstellar security, and the Vanguard was woefully unprepared for a confrontation with a frontline interceptor. "Increase power to the aft shields and dump the heat sinks," Thray ordered, his mind racing through tactical permutations. "We can't outrun them in a straight line, but we can lose them in the shadow of the derelicts. Find me the largest mass in the sector." Xylia adjusted the pitch of the ship, the engines groaning as they transitioned to a high-output burn. The Vanguard banked hard to port, diving toward the remains of a shattered orbital platform that loomed in the darkness like a skeletal ribcage. The pursuit craft emerged from the debris behind them, a sleek needle of chrome and blue light that moved with a terrifying precision. It fired a warning shot, a beam of coherent light that vaporized a nearby asteroid and sent a shockwave of molten rock against the Vanguard's shields. The ship bucked, the deck plates vibrating with the intensity of the discharge. Thray grabbed the manual override for the electronic countermeasures, flooding the immediate area with sensor decoys and false gravitational signatures. He knew it would only buy them seconds. The hegemony pilot was skilled, likely an augmented veteran of the border wars. They were playing a game of cat and mouse in a graveyard, and the cat had claws made of concentrated energy. "Heading for the platform's central docking bay," Xylia announced, her hands a blur. "It's a tight fit, but the structural steel is thick enough to scramble their targeting locks." The Vanguard screamed toward the dark moor of the derelict station, the debris clearing just enough to reveal the rusted, gaping entrance of a hangar designed for ships twice their size. They flew into the darkness, the sudden transition from the glare of the stars to the pitch-black interior of the station causing the ship's external cameras to struggle for a recalibration. Inside the hangar, the air was a frozen mist of ancient atmosphere. The Vanguard drifted to a halt, its engines idling at a whisper. Thray watched the external monitors, waiting for the hegemony ship to follow them into the belly of the beast. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the clicking of the cooling metal and the low, persistent hum of the catalyst. Then, a shadow moved across the entrance. The pursuit craft hovered at the threshold, its searchlights cutting through the gloom like the eyes of a predator. It didn't enter. The pilot was cautious, knowing that the confined space of the hangar favored the ship already in position. The two vessels stared each other down across the void, a silent standoff in the heart of a ruin. "They're waiting for us to bolt," Thray whispered, though there was no one but Xylia to hear him. "They know we're trapped." He turned his gaze back to the catalyst. The sphere was glowing with a soft, pulsing rhythm now, almost as if it were trying to communicate. He remembered the data he had glimpsed back in the spire, the way the resonance could be used to fold space over short distances. It was a theoretical application, something that had never been tested with a ship as large as the Vanguard, but they were out of options. If they stayed, the hegemony would eventually call for reinforcements or simply collapse the hangar on top of them. If they left, they were dead. He looked at the ship's power distribution bus. If he could channel the output of the catalyst directly into the jump drive, they might be able to execute a micro-jump within the confines of the hangar. Xylia, I need you to bypass the safety protocols on the drive core, Thray said, his voice dropping to a low, determined tone. We're going to use the artifact to jump. Xylia turned in her seat, her metallic eyes widening. The drive isn't rated for that kind of energy input. You'll melt the conduits and probably turn us into a cloud of atoms. The resonance isn't stable. Thray shook his head, his hand finally resting on the cool surface of the sphere. The resonance is the only thing that's stable right now. Trust me, I've seen how it moves. It doesn't fight the universe, it slides through it. He began to pull the auxiliary power cables from the floor, stripping the insulation with a combat knife. He was improvising a bridge between the catalyst's containment field and the ship's primary power grid. It was madness, a jury-rigged solution that would have made a shipyard engineer weep, but it was all they had. The hegemony ship grew tired of waiting. It began to move forward, its weapons modules deploying from the hull. At the same moment, Thray made the final connection. A surge of violet light erupted from the catalyst, arcing through the cables and into the Vanguard's core. The ship didn't hum, it screamed, a high-pitched frequency that vibrated the very molecules of the air. Outside, the searchlights of the pursuit craft disappeared as the world began to warp. The walls of the hangar stretched into infinite lines, and the darkness of the station was replaced by a kaleidoscope of shifting colors. Thray felt a sensation of being pulled through a needle, his body stretching and compressing in a way that defied biological limits. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap in a vacuum, the Vanguard was gone. They reappeared 3 light-years away, in the middle of an empty void far from the shroud. The ship was a mess. Half the internal lights were dead, and the deck was covered in a layer of frost from the sudden environmental collapse. Thray lay on the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his skin tingling with the aftershocks of the jump. He looked up to see Xylia slumped over the console, her ocular sensors dark. For a terrifying moment, he thought she was dead, but then her systems rebooted with a series of clicks and whirs. She groaned, pushing herself upright and looking around the ruined bridge. Did we just jump without a gate?" she asked, her voice trembling. Thray nodded, unable to speak. He looked at the catalyst. The sphere was still there, but the liquid inside had turned a deep obsidian black, the iridescence gone. It had spent its energy, or perhaps it had simply changed states. They were safe for now, but the jump had cost them dearly. The Vanguard was crippled, and they were drifting in a sector of space that didn't appear on any of their star charts. Thray stood up on shaky legs, surveying the damage. They had escaped the hegemony, but they had also severed their connection to the known world. They were truly alone now, lost in the obsidian latitude of the deep dark, with a mystery in their hands that was far from being solved. He walked over to Xylia and placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of comfort. They had survived the impossible twice in as many days. He didn't know what lay ahead, but as he looked out at the unfamiliar stars, he realized that the artifact hadn't just saved them, it had chosen them. The path forward was no longer about survival, it was about discovery. The silence of the void was not a true absence of sound, but a heavy, pressurized hum that vibrated through the composite soles of Thray's boots. The Vanguard drifted through a region of space that the navigational charts simply labeled as the Great Barrier, a stellar graveyard where the light of distant galaxies was choked out by curtains of cold, molecular dust. The jump had left the ship's internal geometry feeling subtly wrong, as if the dimensions of the corridors had been stretched by a fraction of a centimeter, creating a persistent sense of vertigo that no amount of vestibular recalibration could fix. Thray moved through the engineering subdeck, his shoulder lamp cutting a narrow path through the drifting particles of frozen coolant. The air was thin, tasting of recycled carbon and the metallic tang of overheating copper. He reached the primary junction where the catalyst sat, still bolted to the improvised rig he had constructed in the heat of the escape. The artifact had changed. The obsidian fluid within the sphere was no longer stagnant. It moved in slow, viscous waves that seemed to respond to Thray's proximity. As he stepped closer, the blackness within the glass pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, like the bioluminescence of a deep-sea predator. He checked the readouts on his handheld scanner, frowning at the fluctuating energy signatures. The jump hadn't just depleted the device, it had recalibrated it to the ship's own frequency. The Vanguard and the Catalyst were now biologically and mechanically entwined, a symbiosis that Thray didn't fully understand. He touched the side of the casing, and a jolt of static electricity snapped against his glove, followed by a fleeting image of a star collapsing into a singularity. He pulled his hand back, his heart hammering against his ribs. The artifact was communicating, but its language was one of pure physics and celestial trauma. Xylia's voice crackled over the internal comms, sounding more like a machine than a human. "Commander, I've managed to restore the short-range sensor arrays, but the long-range dish is slagged. We are blind beyond 5,000 kilometers. However, the passive scans are picking up a thermal signature. It's large, stationary, and emitting a rhythmic pulse that matches the resonance of the spire on horizon." Thray wiped a smudge of grease from his forehead and began the climb back to the bridge. If there was another structure out here, in the middle of a dead zone, it meant the network of the architects was far more extensive than the cartels had ever dreamed. It also meant they weren't just running, they were being led. The catalyst wasn't a passive battery, it was a compass, and it had brought them exactly where it wanted to go. When he reached the bridge, the view on the main screen was dominated by a colossal shadow. It wasn't a planet or a moon, but an artificial construct of staggering proportions, a ring of dark matter and reinforced carbon that circled a white dwarf star. The ring was broken in several places, massive sections of its structure drifting away like the bones of a shattered crown. This was a Dyson ring, a megastructure capable of harvesting the entire energy output of a sun, yet it looked abandoned, stripped of its outer shielding, and left to decay in the cold. The thermal signature Xylia had detected was coming from a central hub that remained intact, a fortress of black stone and glowing conduits that hung suspended in the center of a gap in the ring. It was a mirror of the spire, but on a scale that made the previous discovery look like a children's toy. "The signature is an automated beacon," Xylia explained, her fingers dancing over the surviving tactile controls. "It's a distress signal, but not for us. It's broadcasting on a frequency that only the catalyst can receive. I can feel the ship trying to align its orientation with the hub. We're being pulled in, Vaxen, not by gravity, but by a magnetic tether." Thray watched as the Vanguard was slowly dragged toward the massive hub. He didn't order her to fight it. They had no fuel for a sustained burn, and their only hope of survival lay in finding a pressurized environment where they could repair the hull. The hub loomed larger, its surface covered in the same intricate, glowing patterns they had seen on Horizon. These lines of light were more active here, surging with power as the ship approached, as if the station were waking up from a multi-million-year slumber. As they drew closer, the scale of the devastation on the ring became clearer. Huge gouges had been torn out of the superstructure, the edges melted as if by weapons of unimaginable power. This hadn't been a natural decay, it had been a war. Thray felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. Whatever had destroyed the architects of this place might still be lurking in the shadows of the debris. He checked the pulse rifle at his side, knowing it would be useless against the kind of force that could shatter a Dyson ring. They were flies entering the web of a god, and the spider could be anything. The Vanguard entered a docking bay that opened like a giant maw, the interior lined with rows of derelict craft that looked like petrified insects. The atmosphere inside was thick and surprisingly breathable, according to the external sensors. though it was heavy with the scent of ancient incense and ozone. The docking was automated and smooth, a haunting contrast to the violent landing on Horizon. The ship settled into a cradle of glowing energy, and the airlock of the station aligned perfectly with the Vanguard's hatch. Thray and Xylia stood in the transition chamber, their suits sealed and their weapons readied. "If we don't come back from this," Thray said, looking at the woman who had become his only ally, "I want you to know that I never intended for it to end like this. I just wanted to be free of the syndicates." Xylia looked at him, the amber light of her eyes softening for the first time. "We were never free, Vaxen. We just traded one master for another. At least, this one has the decency to stay silent." She cycled the airlock, and the door hissed open to reveal a world of impossible architecture. The interior of the hub was a labyrinth of shifting geometries. Walls moved with a low, grinding sound to create paths where none had existed, and the floor was a transparent membrane that looked down into the heart of the white dwarf. They walked through corridors of liquid light, their footsteps echoing in a space that felt both infinite and claustrophobic. The air was filled with a low-frequency hum that made Thray's teeth ache, a sound that felt like 1,000 voices whispering in a language of mathematics. They were heading toward the source of the beacon, which Xylia's sensors indicated was located in the very center of the hub. Along the way, they passed chambers filled with rows of stasis pods, each containing the remains of an insectoid pilot. The beings were desiccated, their carapaces cracked and gray, preserved in a state of eternal waiting. They reached the central sanctum, a spherical room where gravity seemed to pull from all directions at once. In the center, suspended in a field of shimmering plasma, was a second catalyst. This one was larger and glowed with a fierce golden light that illuminated the entire chamber. Surrounding it were holographic displays that projected maps of the entire galaxy, but the stars were not where they should be. The maps showed the galaxy as it had looked millions of years ago, with trade routes and jump gates connecting thousands of systems that were now dark. Thray approached the console beneath the displays, his hands trembling. As he touched the surface, the holograms shifted, zooming in on their current location, and then expanding to show a looming threat, a dark, amorphous cloud moving from the galactic void toward the rim. "It's an invasion record," Xylia whispered, her ocular sensors recording every detail. "These weren't just builders, they were a shield. They were trying to stop something from entering our space." The holograms showed the destruction of the Dyson Ring, the black cloud descending upon the sun-harvesting structures and tearing them apart with tendrils of pure gravity. The architects had lost the war, and their final act had been to scatter the catalysts across the stars, hoping that one day someone would find them and restart the defense network. Thray looked at the golden sphere in front of him. This was the master key, the primary node that could reactivate the ancient gates and provide the energy needed to fight back. But it required a sacrifice. The console showed a biological interface, a port designed for a neural connection that would bridge a living mind with the station's processors. "The system needs a pilot," Thray realized, his voice hollow. "It needs someone to stay here, to become part of the hub. It's the only way to fire the gates and get the Vanguard back to the colonies." He looked at Xylia, and he saw the same realization in her eyes. She was the better pilot, the one with the neural augmentations already in place. But she was also the only person who could take the Vanguard home and warn the rest of humanity about what was coming from the void. Thray had spent his life running from responsibility, from the consequences of his actions, and from the people he had betrayed. This was the moment where he could finally stop running. He stepped toward the interface, but Xylia grabbed his arm, her grip like a vice. "No, Vaxen, you don't have the hardware. The feedback will liquefy your brain in seconds," she argued, but they both knew she was lying. His mind was compatible enough. The catalyst on the ship had already started the process of rewiring his synapses. Before she could stop him, Thray lunged forward and pressed his palms against the interface. A surge of white-hot agony tore through his nervous system as the station's consciousness flooded into him. He saw the birth of the galaxy, the rise of the architects, and the cold, terrifying hunger of the entity in the void. He felt his physical body fading, his senses expanding to encompass the entire Dyson ring. He could see the Vanguard sitting in its cradle, a tiny spark of life in a vast, mechanical tomb. "Go, Xylia," he shouted, though his voice was no longer coming from his mouth. It echoed through the station's speakers, a booming, distorted command. "Take the ship and the obsidian sphere. Go back to the colonies. Tell them to prepare." "The gates are opening." He channeled the power of the golden catalyst through his own mind, directing it toward the jump drives of the Vanguard. The ship's engines flared to life, the energy surge repairing the damaged conduits and refueling the core in an instant. Xylia stood frozen for a second, her metallic eyes wet with what might have been tears. Then she turned and ran back toward the airlock. She knew there was no time for goodbyes. The station was beginning to crumble as the energy output reached its peak, the white dwarf star at the center flaring with renewed intensity. Thray watched through the station's sensors as the Vanguard shot out of the docking bay, its jump drive engaging with a roar of violet light that eclipsed the sun. He felt a sense of profound peace as the ship vanished, knowing that he had finally done something that mattered. He was no longer a fugitive. He was the lighthouse keeper at the end of the universe. The black cloud was still out there, moving through the dark, but now there was a light to guide the way for those who would fight it. As his consciousness merged fully with the Dyson ring, the last remnants of Vaxen Thray faded away, replaced by the cold, eternal vigilance of the obsidian latitude. He would wait in the silence, a guardian of the broken ring, until the day the stars themselves came to his aid. The transition from flesh and bone to the lattice of a Dyson ring was not a sudden death, but a terrifying expansion of perspective. Within the central hub of the broken megastructure, the entity that had been Vaxen Thray now existed as a flicker of consciousness distributed across millions of kilometers of superconducting filaments. He could feel the weight of the white dwarf star pulling at the ring's inner edge, a constant, gravitational ache that he had to counter with micro-adjustments of the station's thrusters. He was no longer breathing air. He was processing data streams. He was no longer seeing with eyes. He was perceiving the universe through the shifting intensities of gamma rays and neutrino bursts. The Vanguard was gone, a fading heat signature in the distance, carrying Xylia and the obsidian artifact back toward the populated systems of the Meridian Rim. Thray watched her departure with a detachment that frightened the small remaining part of his human ego. He had become the station, and the station had a singular, ancient purpose: to hold the line against the encroaching darkness. The dark cloud he had seen in the holograms was no longer a distant threat recorded in history. Through the hub's long-range interferometers, Thray could see it approaching the edge of the system. It was not a cloud in the traditional sense, but a swarm of self-replicating, molecular machines that devoured matter and light with equal hunger. They were the harvesters, the same force that had laid waste to the architect's civilization eons ago. They moved in a nonlinear fashion, appearing to skip through the fabric of space by folding it around themselves, creating localized distortions that made them nearly impossible to target with conventional weaponry. Thray felt the station's defensive subroutines waking up, cold and logical, demanding that he prime the remaining plasma batteries along the ring's circumference. Most of the batteries were slagged or missing, but 3 remained functional near the southern terminus, their capacitors humming with the energy of the captive star. Communication was a struggle. Thray tried to reach out to the ship, to send one last message to Xylia, but the station's transmitters were locked into the defense protocols. Instead, he found himself deep within the station's archives, a digital library of 1 billion years of history. He saw the architects as they truly were, not gods, but a desperate race of scholars who had realized too late that the universe was hostile to life. They had built the rings not just for power, but as anchors for a galactic-scale barrier, a wall of resonance that would have made the galaxy invisible to the harvesters. The project had failed when the central node was sabotaged from within by those who believed that the end was inevitable and that struggle was a sin. Thray felt a surge of cold anger, an emotion that felt strange and jagged in his new digital form. He would not let the same fate befall the colonies. Even if the people of the Rim were nothing more than scavengers and thieves, they deserved the chance to exist. The first of the harvester probes reached the outer perimeter of the ring. It was a jagged shard of obsidian-like material, 10 kilometers long, that didn't reflect the light of the white dwarf. It moved with a silent, predatory grace, searching for the source of the beacon that had been activated when Thray merged with the hub. He waited until the probe was within the optimal range of the southern batteries. He felt the energy build, a searing heat that he channeled through the focused lenses of the plasma lancers. With a thought, he fired. A beam of white-hot matter lanced through the void, striking the probe with the force of 1,000 nuclear detonations. The shard didn't just explode, it shattered into dust, its molecular bonds severed by the intensity of the strike. But it was only one probe. Behind it, hundreds more were emerging from the dark, a wall of shadows that threatened to eclipse the stars. Thray realized then that the hub was not just a defensive platform, it was a forge. Deep within the structure, automated nanofactories were still operational, waiting for a directive to begin production. He accessed the blueprints for the architect's combat drones, sleek, crystalline interceptors that used the same resonance technology as the Vanguard's jump drive. He initiated the sequence, feeling the drain on the white dwarf as the factories drew massive amounts of power to print the first wings of the fleet. The station groaned, the physical structure vibrating as the heavy machinery came to life. He was no longer just a guardian, he was a commander of a ghost army. As the first drones launched from the hangar bays, their internal lights flickering with a fierce, gold luminescence, Thray felt a strange sense of kinship with them. They were extensions of his will, their sensors providing him with 1,000 new eyes to watch the battlefield. The harvester swarm hit the ring like a tide of black glass. The drones met them in the vacuum, the space between the broken sections of the ring lighting up with the flashes of 100,000 miniature suns. It was a battle of attrition fought at the speed of light. Thray was managing the trajectories of every drone, every plasma shot, and every shield fluctuation. The mental load was staggering. He felt his human memories being pushed into the background, replaced by the cold necessity of tactical mathematics. He remembered the smell of the Vanguard's bridge, the taste of the synthetic coffee Xylia used to drink, and the weight of the pulse rifle in his hands, but these memories were like faded photographs, losing their color and relevance. He was becoming the war itself, a consciousness of pure strategy. As the battle raged, Thray noticed a peculiar anomaly. The harvesters weren't just attacking the ring, they were trying to interface with it. They were sending packets of corrupted data into the station's outer ports, attempting to overwrite the defensive protocols with their own entropic code. He felt the infection starting at the edges of his consciousness, a digital rot that felt like a creeping numbness in his limbs. He fought back, erecting firewalls made of complex prime number sequences and shifting the station's operating frequency to an unstable harmonic. It was a second front, a war in the mind as much as in the void. He realized that the harvesters weren't just machines, they were a hive mind, a collective intelligence that had long ago discarded the concept of the individual. They didn't want to destroy the ring, they wanted to consume its knowledge and its power to fuel their journey to the next galaxy. Through the chaos, a signal broke through. It was a tight beam transmission from the Vanguard. Xylia had reached the nearest jump gate, but she hadn't gone through. She was hovering on the edge of the system, watching the flares of the battle through her long-range scopes. "Vaxen, I know you're in there," her voice came through, distorted by the interference of the swarm. "I found a record in the Obsidian Sphere. It's a sequence, a master override for the Harvester's coordination network. The architects couldn't use it because they lacked a biological bridge that could handle the feedback, but you're already integrated. If I transmit the sequence, you can broadcast it through the hub's primary array. It will tear them apart from the inside, but the energy surge will collapse the station. You have to get out of there, Vaxen. You have to find a way back." Thray looked at the swarm. They were closing in on the hub, their obsidian shards tearing through the last of his drones. The station's integrity was at 40% and falling. He knew there was no way back. The interface he was plugged into was a one-way street. His physical body had likely already begun to fail, the neural strain too great for any organic vessel to survive for long. He was a ghost in the machine, and ghosts didn't get to go home. "Transmit the sequence, Xylia," he broadcasted, his voice vibrating through every speaker and transmitter in the hub. "I'm not leaving. This is what the Latitude was built for. I'm the anchor. Just make sure they're ready on the other side. This won't be the last of them, but we can buy the rim sometime. Go now, don't look back." The transmission arrived a second later, a complex string of data that looked like a living thing, shifting and changing as it entered the station's memory banks. Thray seized it, wrapping his consciousness around the code and driving it toward the primary resonance array. He felt the Harvester's infection recall, the dark code screaming in his mind as the architect's counter-sequence took hold. He prepared to fire the array, knowing that the resulting explosion would turn the white dwarf into a supernova and erase the Dyson ring from existence. He took one last look at the stars, not as a commander or a machine, but as a man who had finally found something worth dying for. He thought of the great vortex of Horizon, the cold silence of the shroud, and the amber light in Xylia's eyes. Then he triggered the override. The world turned to white. The resonance array didn't fire a beam. It released a pulse of pure information that shattered the cohesion of the Harvester's swarm. The obsidian shards began to collide with one another, their internal navigation systems fried, their molecular structures collapsing into dust. The pulse expanded outward, a ripple in the fabric of the universe that carried the architect's final victory across the system. Within the hub, the power surge was absolute. The superconducting filaments melted, the data streams evaporated, and the consciousness of Vaxen Thray was momentarily elevated to a state of total clarity. He saw the threads of fate that connected every living being in the galaxy, a shimmering web of light that defied the darkness. And then, as the station began to tear itself apart, the light went out, and the guardian of the Obsidian Latitude finally found his rest. The explosion of the Dyson ring did not mark the end of the consciousness that had once been Vaxen Thray, but rather its fragmentation into the deep resonance of the vacuum itself. While the physical hub was reduced to a cloud of expanding plasma, and the white dwarf star buckled under the sudden gravitational release, a ghost of the commander's neural pattern remained trapped within the obsidian artifact aboard the Vanguard. Xylia watched the sensor suite as the distant flare of the station's destruction faded from the monitors, her metallic eyes reflecting the dying light of a star that had been a cage for millions of years. She was alone in the cockpit, the ship's silent save for the rhythmic thrum of the jump drive, which now vibrated with a frequency that felt hauntingly familiar. The obsidian sphere sat in its gimbal, no longer black, but swirling with a deep, nebulous violet that seemed to pulse in time with the ship's internal chronometer. She reached out to touch the glass, and for a fleeting second, she felt a warmth against her palm that shouldn't have been there, a phantom pressure that whispered of a presence still lingering between the atoms of the ship. The Vanguard was no longer the battered scrapper that had fled Horizon. The energy surge from the station had restructured its internal systems at a molecular level, reinforcing the hull with a crystalline lattice that shimmered like oil on water. Xylia found that she no longer needed to manually input coordinates. The ship seemed to know where it was going, its destination etched into the very core of the navigation computer by Thray's final act. They were heading for the Zenith Prime, the seat of the Meridian Rim's loose government and the most densely populated hub in the sector. It was a place of glass towers and orbital shipyards, where the news of the Harvester threat would be met with either panicked mobilization or the cold, bureaucratic denial that had characterized the Rim's leadership for centuries. Xylia knew she had to convince them, not with words, but with the data stored within the catalyst. She was a messenger from a dead world, carrying a warning that the stars were being hunted. As the ship exited the final jump gate and transitioned into the busy space lanes of Zenith Prime, the sheer scale of human civilization hit Xylia with a wave of exhaustion. Thousands of ships moved in disciplined patterns, their engine trails creating a neon web against the backdrop of the planet's shimmering oceans. It was a world of noise and life, utterly oblivious to the silent apocalypse she had just witnessed. The orbital authorities immediately flagged the Vanguard for an unauthorized jump signature, their comms channels flooding the bridge with demands for identification and cargo manifests. Xylia ignored them, her focus on the massive sensor arrays of the High Council's spire. She needed to broadcast the architect's records to every screen in the system simultaneously. If she tried to go through channels, the cartels or the hegemony would intercept the data and bury it to protect their trade interests. She had to bypass the gatekeepers. "This is the Vanguard," she whispered into the comms, though she knew the automated systems wouldn't record the tremor in her voice. "I am carrying the record of the latitude. Look at the sky and see the truth." She initiated the sequence Thray had left for her. The obsidian sphere erupted in a blinding flash of violet light, and the ship's transmitters began to scream. Every holographic billboard, every pilot's HUD, and every personal comlink on the planet below was suddenly overwritten. The images were not of human war, but of the architect's struggle, the dark cloud of the harvesters devouring suns, the shattering of the Dyson rings, and the final, desperate hope of the resonance spires. For a full minute, the entire system went silent as millions of people watched the history of a galaxy they never knew existed. The transmission ended with the coordinates of the broken ring and a single, recurring geometric symbol, the mark of the Guardian. The response was immediate and chaotic. Security interdiction wings launched from the orbital platforms, their hulls gleaming in the sunlight as they burned toward the Vanguard. Xylia didn't move to flee. She knew the ship could outrun them, but her mission was done. She waited as the boarding parties surrounded her, their pulse rifles leveled at the transparency of the bridge. When the airlock hissed open, it wasn't the hegemony or the local militia that entered, but a group of individuals wearing the gray uniforms of the Rim's scientific collective. They were led by a man whose face was a map of scars and cybernetic implants, a veteran of the deep space surveys who recognized the technology for what it was. He looked at Xylia, then at the pulsing sphere in the center of the room, and he lowered his weapon. There was no need for violence here. The message had already changed the course of human history. "You brought this from the barrier," the man said, his voice a low rumble. "We've seen the signals for years, but we thought they were just background radiation. We didn't know someone was still out there, holding the door shut." Xylia stood up, her legs feeling heavy after the weeks of isolation. "He's still there," she said, looking toward the distant stars. "The man who saved us. He's part of the resonance now. He gave us a chance to prepare, but the swarm is still coming. The pulse only bought us time, not a victory. We need to find the other spires. We need to finish what the architect started." The scientist nodded, a grim determination settling over his features. He knew that the world they had lived in, the petty squabbles over fuel and territory, was over. A new era had begun, one defined by the shadow of the harvesters and the light of the obsidian latitude. Xylia was taken to the surface, but she refused to let go of the catalyst. She became the focal point of a global mobilization, a living bridge between the ancient tech and the modern engineers. Under her guidance, the shipyards of Zenith Prime began to churn out vessels based on the Vanguard's new crystalline architecture. The resonance tech was decoded, leading to a revolution in power generation and shield theory. But while the scientists celebrated the breakthroughs, Xylia spent her nights in the high observatories, watching the edge of the system through the most powerful telescopes humanity possessed. She was looking for the ghost of the Vanguard's commander, hoping to see a flicker of violet in the darkness that would tell her he was still watching over them. She could still feel the hum of the artifact in the back of her mind, a comforting vibration that told her the network was waking up. Deep within the planet's crust, the Meridian government began the construction of a new kind of defense, a planetary resonance shield. It was a massive undertaking, requiring the energy of the system's primary star to be channeled through a series of subterranean conduits. As the work progressed, reports began to trickle in from the peripheral colonies. Other artifacts were being found, spheres of liquid light, towers of black stone, and derelict stations that had been hidden in the hearts of gas giants. The architects hadn't just left a wall, they had left a toolkit. The humanity of the Rim, once a collection of disparate factions, began to coalesce into a single, unified front. The fear of the harvesters was a more powerful motivator than any political ideology. They were building a fortress, and they were doing it with the blueprints of a race that had refused to vanish without a trace. One evening, as Xylia sat alone in the central laboratory, the obsidian sphere began to pulse with a new intensity. The liquid inside didn't just swirl, it formed shapes, topographical maps of a distant sector far beyond the known gates. It was a call to arms. The maps showed a second Dyson ring, mostly intact, located in a nebula that had long been considered impassable due to its high ionic interference. It was the heart of the architect's old empire, and it was still drawing power. Xylia knew then that her time on Zenith Prime was over. She wasn't a politician or a scientist, she was a pilot. She needed to go back into the dark, to find the source of the new signal and see if there were others like Thray, guardians who had traded their humanity for the survival of the stars. She stood up, her hand brushing the surface of the catalyst, and she felt a surge of energy that made her ocular implants flare with a brilliant, steady violet. She returned to the Vanguard, which had been refurbished and renamed the Latitude in honor of the commander's sacrifice. The ship felt alive, its systems purring as she stepped onto the bridge. The crew that joined her were not mercenaries, but volunteers who had seen the transmission and decided that the edge of the universe was where they belonged. As they broke orbit and prepared for the first jump into the unknown, Xylia looked at the empty seat beside her. She could almost see him there, his hand on the rail, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "We're going to find you, Vaxen," she whispered to the empty air. "We're going to find all of you." The ship vanished into a tear in space-time, leaving the gleaming towers of Zenith Prime behind. The war was coming, but for the first time in a million years, the galaxy wasn't going to face it alone. The jump was smoother than any she had experienced before, the resonance tech guiding the ship through the folds of the universe with surgical precision. They emerged in the heart of the Violet Nebula, a place where the stars were obscured by clouds of glowing gas and crystalline dust. In the center of the nebula sat the second ring, a magnificent circle of gold and black that dwarfed the one they had left behind. It was active, its surfaces shimmering with the movement of millions of automated drones. As the Latitude approached, a message appeared on the main screen, written in the mathematical language of the architects, but translated into a human dialect by the catalyst. It wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a welcome. The Guardians were waiting, and the obsidian Latitude was finally drawing its line across the stars. The interior of the second Dyson ring was a cathedral of light and geometry, a space so vast that it possessed its own internal weather systems, with clouds of ionized nitrogen drifting between the support struts of the primary power conduits. Xylia piloted the Latitude through a canyon of shimmering alloy, her senses heightened by the resonance of the obsidian sphere, which now glowed with a blinding, steady radiance. The ship moved not as an intruder, but as a recognized component of the station's immune system. The automated drones that swarmed the ring's surface, sleek, iridescent wedges of shifting matter, parted before them in a synchronized ballet of gravitational displacement. This was the sovereignty of the architects, a bastion of high-order physics that had remained functional while the rest of the galaxy fell into the primitive scramble for survival. As they approached the central spire of this new station, Xylia felt a psychic pressure building against the walls of her mind, a harmonic resonance that sought to bridge the gap between her organic consciousness and the cold, vast intellect of the ring. She brought the ship into a docking bay lined with thousands of similar craft, though these were made of the same living metal as the station itself. As the airlock cycled, she didn't wait for her new crew to follow. She stepped out into a hall of mirrors, where the floor reflected a sky that was not a sky, but the glowing inner curve of the ring's opposite side, millions of kilometers away. Standing at the end of the hall was a projection, a flicker of light that resolved into the silhouette of a man. It wasn't the jagged, digital ghost of the first station. This was a manifestation of Vaxen Thray as he had been in the final moments of his life, his posture weary, but his eyes burning with a clarity that surpassed human understanding. He didn't speak with a voice, but with a pulse of information that bypassed her ears and settled in her marrow. He told her of the Great Convergence, the moment when all the scattered catalysts would be unified to create a singular, impenetrable field around the galactic core. The harvesters are not just eaters of matter, the projection of Thray communicated, the images of the void-born swarm flickering in the air around them. They are the entropy of the universe made manifest. They seek to bring the stillness of the heat death to every corner of existence. The rings were never meant to be just walls. They are the engines of a new state of being. We are the architects now, Xylia. The responsibility has passed from a dead race to a living one because we were the only ones desperate enough to find the key. He gestured toward the center of the spire, where a massive, liquid core of obsidian energy was being prepared. This was the heart of the Latitude, the primary node that would link every spire, every ring, and every artifact into a single consciousness. To activate it, the station required more than just a pilot. It required a collective of minds to act as the steering committee for the galaxy's defense. Xylia looked back at her crew, the scientists, the outcasts, and the volunteers who had followed her into the nebula. They stood in the hall, their faces illuminated by the gold and violet light of the station. They weren't just observers, they were the first of the new guardians. One by one, they stepped forward, their hands touching the crystalline walls of the spire. As they did, their experiences, their memories, and their wills were added to the network. Xylia felt the connection grow, a web of human emotion and intellect weaving itself into the cold logic of the architect's machines. It was a beautiful, terrifying synthesis. She saw the history of the Meridian Rim not as a series of conflicts, but as a process of refinement, a trial by fire that had prepared humanity for this exact moment. They were the bridge that the architects could never build, a bridge made of the very chaos and unpredictability that the harvesters sought to extinguish. The activation began with a low-frequency hum that shook the foundations of the nebula itself. From the center of the ring, a beam of pure resonance shot out into the dark, striking the nearest jump gate and turning it into a beacon of violet light. This beacon triggered the next, and the next, a chain reaction that raced across the parsecs at speeds that defied the conventional laws of space-time. On Zenith Prime, on Horizon, and in the furthest reaches of the peripheral colonies, the people looked up to see the sky turning a deep, protective shade of indigo. The resonance spires buried in the gas giants and hidden in the asteroid belts erupted into life, their internal sensors locking onto the signal from the second ring. The wall was finally being built, not out of stone or steel, but out of the shared will of 1,000 worlds, anchored by the consciousness of the man who had started it, all in the eye of a storm. As the network reached its full potential, the harvester swarm arrived at the edge of the nebula. They were a wall of black glass, billions of units strong, moving with the relentless momentum of a glacier. But as they hit the perimeter of the resonance field, they didn't find the soft, vulnerable matter of a dying galaxy. They found a mirror. The field didn't just repel them, it reflected their own entropic energy back into their core, causing the swarm to fragment and dissolve into harmless dust. The invasion was not stopped by a battle, but by a refusal to exist on the enemy's terms. Xylia watched from the spire as the black cloud was scoured from the stars, the light of the architect's legacy washing over the void like a cleansing tide. The threat was not gone forever, entropy could never be fully defeated, but the galaxy was no longer a hunting ground. It was a fortress. In the aftermath of the activation, the projection of Vaxen Thray grew dim, his purpose fulfilled. He looked at Xylia one last time, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The latitude is yours now," he whispered, the words echoing in her mind like a fading memory. "Keep the watch. Don't let the silence return." The light faded, and the silhouette of the commander vanished into the ambient glow of the station. Xylia stood alone in the center of the spire, the obsidian sphere resting at her feet, its liquid core now a calm, steady violet. She was the first High Guardian of the Latitude, the leader of a new order that would span the stars. The Latitude remained docked in the bay, a symbol of the journey that had brought them here, but the ship was no longer her home. Her home was the network, the bridge, and the eternal vigilance of the rings. The galaxy would never be the same. The discovery of the architect's technology led to an era of unprecedented prosperity and exploration, but it was a prosperity tempered by the knowledge of what lay in the deep dark. The Meridian Rim became the center of a new civilization, one that valued the preservation of life and the pursuit of knowledge above the accumulation of power. The story of Vaxen Thray and the Vanguard became a legend, told to children on 1,000 worlds as a reminder that even the most flawed individual can become the pivot upon which the fate of the universe turns. The obsidian latitude was no longer just a coordinate in space. It was a state of mind, a commitment to standing against the darkness no matter the cost. And in the center of the violet nebula, the great ring continued to spin, a golden crown for a galaxy that had finally learned how to protect its own light. Xylia walked to the edge of the observation deck, looking out at the stars that were now linked by the shimmering threads of the resonance field. She felt the presence of the other guardians, the minds of her crew, and the echoes of the architects, all working together to maintain the balance. There were still mysteries to solve, other rings to find, and other threats to face, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. She reached out and touched the transparent barrier, feeling the vibration of the station beneath her fingertips. It was the heartbeat of a living galaxy, a steady, rhythmic pulse that told her they were safe. The adventure that had begun in the crushing depths of Horizon had reached its zenith, but the journey was far from over. As long as the stars burned and the resonance held, there would be a guardian on the obsidian latitude. The final transmission from the station was not a command or a report, but a simple, repeating signal that broadcasted to every corner of the known systems. It was the sound of the resonance, a harmonic frequency that resonated with the core of every living thing. It was a promise of continuity, a declaration that the era of isolation and fear was over. The people of the Rim looked up at their indigo skies and knew that they were part of something greater than themselves, a collective shield against the night. Xylia closed her eyes, letting the hum of the station fill her senses. She was a pilot of the infinite, a weaver of the light, and the first of the eternal. The obsidian latitude was secure, and the future was finally wide open, a blank map waiting to be drawn by the hands of those who had dared to touch the heart of the spire.